Video 17, Kind and Continuity. People everywhere use language to describe things, to tell what happened, to tell what typically happens, and to tell others what to do. Languages typically use select grammatical features to help speakers efficiently distinguish between these uses. To get a feel for how this works in English, we'll compare a few short example texts. Notice that these two paragraphs are nearly identical. They contain the same nouns and verbs. The only differences between them are the forms of the verbs. The verbs in the first paragraph are all in what your middle school English teacher called past tense, while those in the second paragraph are in present tense. What difference does this make to our interpretation of the text? One important difference is that we would usually understand the first kind of text to be telling us about something that happened once at a particular place and time, while we can understand the second as telling us what typically happens in certain situations. If we tweak the verbs again and change the pronoun, we get another kind of message. This time we interpret the paragraph as telling us what someone wants us to do. While the first paragraph is asserting that the events being described actually happened once, and the second paragraph can be used to assert that they happened more than once, this paragraph makes no assertion that they have ever happened, but only that the speaker wants us to do them at some future time. Notice that with all three paragraphs, we assume that the activities described take place in the order that they occur in the paragraph. So, in all three, the driveway is swept after the walks are edged, but before the mulch is cleaned out. A fourth use of language is to describe the state of something. For example, this paragraph describes the lawn at a point in time. This paragraph's use of the verbs to be and to have is typical of a description. The importance of any events that are mentioned in descriptions usually derives from their impact on the scene, not on the sequence in which they occurred. We can say then that in English, there is a strong correlation between the verbal forms we find in a text and the use to which it is being put. There are, of course, lots of complexities and nuances. There are occasions, for example, when present tense verbs are used to convey an account of a past event. This use of present tense is more likely when someone is relating a personal experience over lunch or telling a joke than when writing a newspaper article or an essay on what one did over the summer. It is also very common for different kinds of texts to get used together. For example, it is normal for stories to contain passages that are mostly descriptions or dialogue, or for sermons to contain stories. Grammar helps speakers distinguish between the different kinds of information found in different kinds of texts and helps listeners infer the speaker's intended use of each kind. There are also occasions when everything in a text does not occur in the order in which it is told. Let's take a closer look at how this works by considering a story. Stories, whether true or made up, are essentially an account of a chain of events happening in sequence. Stories include mention of other events, however, that do not occur as part of this chain. Language provides tools to indicate which events are part of the chain and which are not. Before he went to work, Jim mowed the lawn. First, he removed the sticks that had fallen from the tree. Then he filled the tank with gas and started the mower. He had sharpened the blade so the cut was clean and even. He went round the yard in a clockwise direction, edged the walks, swept the driveway, and cleaned out the mulch. By the time he finished, it was raining, so he put the mower in the shed, closed the door to keep the cat out, and went back to the house to change his shoes. Finally, he got in the car and drove off. This story contains a couple of dozen different events, but only some of them happen one after another in succession. It is this chain of events that makes up the backbone of the story. Stories told in English usually used past tense verbs to tell the listener which events are part of that succession. A look at the verbs in the clauses that form the event line of this story shows that that is a strategy used here as well. Now let's consider the parts of the story that do not advance the action. The forms of the verbs in these clauses are a bit of a mishmash. The first thing we notice is that there are some past tense forms among them. Doesn't our rule suggest that these should be interpreted as indicating that these events are part of the succession that make up the backbone of the story? Well, it would, except that verb tense is not the only tool in our grammatical toolbox to remove information from the main sequence. In the first instance, the word before alerts us that what follows is intended to orient the story in time. The word first that follows the introduction gives us a clue that the speaker is moving from orienting material to the events of the story itself. Further on in the story, we see that finished is in the past tense as well, but this verb to is preceded by a phrase that tells us that what follows is meant to orient us in time, but is not intended to advance the progress of the story. The storyteller uses several other grammatical tools to tell us that certain events should not be understood as part of the main sequence. The tool used here is a perfect tense. These two verbs in past perfect indicate that the events they describe happen before the events described in the storyline. These two instances of the verb to be are signals that the setting or circumstances are being described, but not that the story is moving ahead. These two verbs in the infinitive indicate the purpose of an action, but do not place an event in the story sequence. It is pretty common for languages to use one grammatical form to convey the successive events in a story and multiple other tools to indicate events that are not part of the story's baseline development. These strategies help listeners process information because they distinguish between the chain of events that make up the chronological sequence of the story and events which do not form part of that chain. The ability to make this distinction greatly enhances the clarity, efficiency, and vividness of communication. Just as languages use grammatical tools to help listeners keep track of the succession of events in a story, they also have tools to help them keep track of the people and objects that have roles in those events. Sometimes their use can seem a little counterintuitive. For example, in our story, Jim is the character responsible for all the action. Nonetheless, he is only named once, while the mower is named twice. Shouldn't the star of the show get more attention? The answer, of course, is that he does, but in every other instance, Jim is referred to with a pronoun. But if Jim is more important, why doesn't Jim's name get used more often? Well, let's see what the story is like if we replace all of those pronouns with Jim's name. The story now begins, before he went to work, Jim mowed the lawn. First, Jim removed the sticks that had fallen from the tree. Then Jim filled the tank with gas and started the mower. What effect does this have? While substituting Jim's name for the pronoun changes nothing about the actions or actors that make up the story, it still sounds a little odd. One interpretation of the change might be that the narrator is emphasizing that it was Jim who did all the work and not Pete or Sally. After the first mention, we tend to use names, and even nouns in general, only if we think our audience won't be able to identify who or what we're talking about if we just use a pronoun. If we use a noun to refer to a person or thing after they were first mentioned, we're either highlighting that person or thing for emphasis, or trying to help our listeners resolve an ambiguous reference. So while there is no need to repeat Jim's name after he is introduced at the beginning of the story, we do need to repeat the word mower near the end. This is because, if we replace the second mower with a pronoun, the grammar of the story makes it possible that it refers to mulch and not to mower. There are even times when using a pronoun is too much. In this sentence from the beginning of the video, the name Jim shows that Jim is the subject of the first verb, and the pronoun he indicates that he is also the subject of the second. But what about the others? In our previous discussion, we saw what making the subject of all these verbs explicit might convey, but why wouldn't we want to use a pronoun as the subject of most of them? Well, we might, at least some of them, but leaving them in implies a degree of insistence that leaving them out does not. In the current context, including only the first pronoun is sufficient to communicate the subject of all the nouns. Including more adds a subtle impact that may not be obvious to non-native speakers of English. Using verb tense to keep track of the storyline and pronouns to keep characters and objects straight in listeners' minds are more examples of how languages use their grammatical tools in multiple ways. They help us distinguish what is important from what is peripheral, what is surprising from what is expected, and what is new from what is old at the same time that they distinguish subjects from objects, singular from plural, and orient the things we talk about in time and space. The choice of tools that any given language uses to accomplish these things can be quite different from those used by another. As we'll see later on, these differences can create challenges for the translator.